For more on the military and diplomatic operations, let's bring in our panel. Matthew Shoemaker is a former Defense Intelligence Agency officer. Captain Robert Wells was National Security Special Advisor to former Vice President Dick Cheney. And Miranda Devine is a New York Post columnist, Fox News contributor, and author of the new book, Laptop from Hell. All right, panel, let's get first off into this question of where Russia goes from here. We're 3 weeks in. They appeared stalled in certain places, though making progress in the south. I'll start with you, Matthew. When you look at where Russia has moved to this point, where do they go from here? And they have overwhelming capacity here. Is it going to reach the point that Russia begins to eventually get it together and show that capacity?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me on. It seems like President Putin's goals have not changed. The sanctions that the West has imposed on him have not deterred him, and his goals still seem to be to decapitate the Ukrainian government and to denazify the country. The problem, though, seems that since the convoys have seemed to stall around Kyiv, and as you mentioned, the progress that they've made has been significantly slowed. There is a very big difference between the political goals and the military ability to achieve those goals. It seems, particularly for yesterday, the attack on the military base outside of Lviv, is that on the one hand, President Putin is sending a message to the West, as you noted, but at the same time, there have been reports that there have been Russian reconnaissance teams viewing in the Lviv area to see if they could possibly open up, if you will, another area of conflict in the Lviv area. Lviv itself is a very strategic point. It is most likely the area by which the Ukrainian military has its headquarters, and it's also likely the area that the West is funneling weapons and supplies through. So it performs a very significant point, and the fact that President Putin was willing to attack it yesterday suggests that he knows that it is a very significant point.
Yeah, we've seen a greater assault on civilians here, in particular over the last 3 weeks since this invasion began. And as you noted, the Kremlin using this phrase, the denazification, part of this false pretense that Vladimir Putin used to crash into Ukraine. Captain Wells, when do you think that this strategy of encircling cities really begins to take hold? And when do you think, or do you think, that the Russian military is going to finally begin to take control of some of these population centers? Or are they outrunning their supply lines here?
Well, thank you very much. And picking up on Matt's point and your questions, Rich, looking at Mr. Putin, I think he's really overreached with regard to his attack on Ukraine. I think looking at the encirclement of Kyiv is the most likely outcome, and still having the Ukrainians valiantly protecting Kyiv, their city. I think Lviv is an opportunity for the West and for the United States, the United Kingdom, other countries to continue to support with arms the Ukrainian leadership and the defense needs for Stinger missiles, as well as the anti-tank weaponry. But I think the Russians have overreached. I think Mr. Putin has overreached as well. I've read recent articles about not allowing Putin to win and not allowing appeasement by our diplomats with regard to the outcome as we see it. We should actually be very realistic and up our game with regard to supporting the Ukrainians. Obviously, we have to do more with the refugee relief. We can do more and still support with regard to lethal aid coming into Russia. I think we should also continue to implement, be very creative, do more with our sanctions enforcement against the Russian Federation, and let him feel the heat. He's just overstretched, in my view, and I think his military is going to be bogged down. So I've also heard it termed a Pyrrhic victory with regard to any type of capitulation inside Kyiv. And I think that's the proper term for it.
Miranda, what about this nexus now between China and Russia? China has been loath to, at least early on in this invasion, publicly support or go against Vladimir Putin here. Now there's this news report out that Russia is asking China for armaments. What do we make of this relationship, and do you think this is a legitimate ask here?
Thanks, Rich. Look, I think tomorrow we have Jake Sullivan meeting with the Chinese, and we know that Russia is isolated. Nobody wants to associate themselves on the world stage with Russia or be isolated. China does not want to be further isolated by the West. It will be seeing this as an opportunity to try and regain some of the lost relationships through the Wuhan virus. And, the myth about Russia's military might has been completely exploded by this overreach, as we're saying, by Vladimir Putin into Ukraine. He was expecting to have an easy push into Ukraine. It hasn't turned out that way. So I think China will now be manoeuvring its way back into the good books of the West. And, its benefits from aligning itself with Russia are far outweighed by the business that it does with the West. So there are voices inside China now calling for China to extricate itself from Russia as quickly as possible.
Miranda Devine, Matthew Shoemaker, and Captain Robert Wells, thank you all for joining us, and we'll be checking back in with you all later this hour.